Okay, so here's the common problem. I have downloaded 2 very big images, and this is a sample problem, but it applies across the board. If I open these, let me see if Picture Viewer will handle opening them. Let's just double click and see what happens. So these are straight from a Nikon. Not my Nikon, by the way. I got these off the internet. So we have trees. We also have a lovely bride. Congratulations. Now, these images are pretty big. You can even see the file size. We're talking 30 megabyte JPEG, 18 megabyte JPEG. If we get a little bit of info, show me the info. Windows is not showing me the info. The resolution, oh yeah, well, we can see it here. The resolution is quite big, 7,360 by 4912. The trees are similar, so that must be something just the regular resolution coming off of a Nikon camera. And here's the common problem. You got your TouchDesigner project. I'm running this at 30 FPS just because I'm on a not amazing laptop right now. Let me get rid of that. So what happens is we take these images, we try to load them, and then boom, project comes to a halt for many seconds at a time. And we have no idea how to deal with this. We're looking around in the parameters. We're like, oh God, parameters, please help us. But unfortunately, texture management is not easy or even possible to do correctly from the parameters themselves. So we have to dive into a little bit of Python to deal with this, which should not be too tricky if you've all done our intro to Python and intermediate Python tutorials. So the way we get around this is first and foremost by using the preload Python command on a movie file in top. So if we're not familiar with a lot of the Python abilities of a movie file in top, best thing to do is go to the help page, the Python help page for the movie file in top, and you'll see all these different members we have, which gives us the information like file height, audio, the index, pre-RAID status, lots of really useful stuff. And then we have 2 methods that are really important, unload and preload. Now, if you've been going through your whole life and you've never had to preload and unload, you're just the luckiest human being alive, because without preload and unload, I wouldn't be able to do half of my projects. And we're going to talk about both, as well as some of the useful members that we can use to make really kind of high-performing and non-disruptive media players that aren't going to like drop a bunch of frames or tank our project momentarily. So the first one I'm going to start with is preload. And essentially what preload does is it takes the textures behind the scenes and uploads them to the GPU asynchronously from your process. So this is important because as we saw in that previous example where I dragged and dropped them, that image of the forest onto the network, it stalled. If I do the same thing with the other one, the wedding picture, we can see my project stalls for a few long seconds. Now, if I go to a movie file in, and this is one of the secrets to preloading, is you can't look at the image while you're preloading. If there's anything in your network that displays the image, that short circuits the preload commands. So, for example, if I, let's show you an example here. If I put a text that here, and I type in op movie file in one.preload, and for example, I do something like, let me just turn off the play and even just try and load one of these in, and I right-click on my preload. You'll see, even though I'm trying to preload, we saw the texture went black for a moment, there was a little square in the bottom right, and then my timeline dropped. Because one of the fundamental elements of preloading and managing textures is actually removing them completely from the display. And that's why you'll see a lot of the transition components, a lot of the higher level pros use, and even the one like in our Elburz IO, I think we got a transition tool in there. They're all based on using select tops, because a select top can essentially leave this media standing here completely hide it from the screen while it's selecting something else. And then when this is finally preloaded, then it can select the correct texture and display it. So if we were going to preload this, and I'll talk through all the little steps, and then we'll start like building scripts and automating it together. But essentially, some of the things I need for this to happen correctly is a movie file in. I need no aspect of it to be visible in my viewers or on the display. I need my play button to be off. Then I need the file name pointing at the right place. And you'll see when I hit open, I'm not going to drop frames here. That's because even though this file is here, because the texture isn't actually getting to the screen, if I middle click on this, this still is 1280 by 720. This is still technically has the other one loaded, the banana loaded. Only when I go to click, either to activate my viewer, if I play it to display it, only at that moment is TouchDesigner like, oh my God, I have to like unload the last thing and get this new thing ready. And in that little split here where we have, play turned off, we have the image file in the name, we're not displaying anything. If I run a preload, what we'll see is doesn't drop frames like crazy like before. And then after a while, all of a sudden, you'll see the information, if we middle click on our movie file in top, changes to be that of the new image, which is 7360 by 4912. And then now, if I was to display the viewer, no frame drop. So that's the crux. Like if you were here for like 10 minutes and you're like, oh, I gotta go eat dinner, and you turned it off, I would say this, like right now, is that you've understood the basic thing that needs to happen. And then everything else, we're just building on that, trying to make it easier on our lives, building a few scripts. But that's the essential. You want play turned off. You need all the viewers turned off. You need it to not go to the output. You need the correct file name for the new asset, and then you could hit this .preload Python command. Now, I want to also show really quickly what I mean by can't be going to the screen. Because what often happens is we'll have a situation like this where maybe we have a couple of movie file in tops, and they're all getting composited together. However we do over maybe or under. I mean, it doesn't really matter. It'll end up being the same thing. But essentially, we have a situation like this. And we might think to ourselves, well, the movie file in, I'm not seeing it, but something else is displaying it. This other composite is displaying it. And even if, we're not cooking this or this, just the mere fact that this composite has the texture in it is pulling it towards something visible. In this case, the viewer could also be the output. That alone is enough to trigger the short circuiting of the preload. So for example, if I try and load in this wedding photo, I got to hit play. It's going to tank while it loads that image. So if we were going to build a bit of a media player around this, there's a bunch of things that I normally kind of build around it. First is just my preload script, which is usually just the movie file in plus preload. Then what I'll do is I'll make another script for unloading. And unloading is an interesting thing that we can do because when you think about the memory on the GPU, and if you folks haven't read the old TouchDesigner book that I wrote a long time ago, let me see here if I can get a PDF real quick. There's a section in it that really nicely describes memory fragmentation on the GPU. And we also have that, I think, in the optimization workshop. But GPU memory fragmentation these days is becoming less common because the memory space available, most of our GPUs are 4 gigs, 6 gigs, 10 gigs, 12 gigs, 24 gigs. I mean, it's getting better every year, which is nice. But also the resolution of our textures is also getting bigger. So I'm hoping that the texture resolution stays the same while the memory keeps getting bigger. But what happens is if we preload, we are going into memory and dropping kind of a new block in that memory for our texture. If we were then to unload it, we are essentially freeing it up. If we don't unload it, so there's a couple of conditions here. This is why unloading gets a little bit complicated. If you unload, which is a good habit to get into, first of all, we can avoid triggering garbage collection on the GPU because we're unloading textures ourselves. Ideally, the best case scenario is that when you unload that texture from its space, you write over the same space with a new texture. Now, if it's a different size, hopefully there's enough kind of space in the GPU memory block to kind of just keep going or shrink it down. Now, if it's the same size, that's ideal. And I think I talk about that in the optimization workshop, where one of the best things you can do to optimize a system that's kind of heavily using a lot of media is to conform all your media to the same size. Even if you have, a bunch of icons that are all slightly different sizes, just put them on a background that's transparent, that's 512 by 512, or try and make all your media 1920 by 1080 or 4K or whatever it is, because that allows you to use unloading in a very efficient way. Because if I was to do op movie file in dot unload, and we look at the documentation, unload actually has a very useful argument called cache memory. And what that allows you to do is take a little bit of power over GPU memory management, in the sense that if I have a 1920 by 1080 image and I have another 1920 by 1080 image that I want to load in, if I was to just drop it in, there's a little bit of logic behind the scenes in TouchDesigner that also tries to help you with this if you don't unload. But you could end up in a situation where you essentially drop the new 1080p texture in a separate memory block, and then your old one kind of just gets left there and then unloaded, and hopefully something can slot in there. But if you specifically set cache memory true, in this case by default it's always false, if we set it to true, essentially what we're doing is we're unloading that texture out of memory, but we're keeping the same memory allocation block. We're not just giving it up. That means when we go to load in the new texture, which has to be the same resolution for this to work, same resolution, same bit depth, all that same format, then what it can do is the GPU doesn't need to allocate new memory, which is something we try and avoid because it can get slow on these big textures. And once we don't need to allocate new memory, all of a sudden preloading becomes a lot faster because it's just a case of CPU to GPU transfer of data. So in this case, like if we're working with these really big textures, I would always cache memory equals true, because I know the textures are going to be the same size. I know they're kind of just going to be swapping in and out on top of each other. That's the best case scenario. Cache memory equals true is amazing for this. It's a huge optimization boost. Because then what I can do is, for example, without this being seen, unload it. I'll turn play off. That's always a good thing. Switch the asset underneath it to be the other one. Hit preload again. I dropped some frames there, but that might be just because my computer is not very good. On a decent computer, you won't drop frames. And then if I reveal it, you can see it doesn't drop any frames. And you can keep doing this cycle of basically swapping assets, unloading, cache memory true, reload. Oh, that's my hard drive. But the process is solid. So with that said, we got preloading. Always need to do it. Unloading. You don't always need to do it, but if you're using these really big textures or really large movies, I would say it's always better for you to take control of that. And especially if you've done a bit of pre-planning and all of your textures that are really big are all the same size, then all of a sudden you're saving the hassle of having TouchDesigner do a bunch of like behind the scenes voodoo. You're saving the GPU from kicking in with its own voodoo. So it's always good to use. Now, the other question that always comes up around this is, when I preload, like how do I know when it's ready? Like how do I know when to hit play? How do I know when it's ready to go? Because I need to preload and I need to go. How do I deal with this time segment? And I think there's a couple of different really efficient ways to approach this problem. And by all means, if you're following along, feel free to ask questions. But the couple of ways that I find are, one is the easiest, which is preload so far in advance that it doesn't matter. Because preloading usually will not take more than like 1 full second. I find like in any project I've ever done, if I hit preload and I wait one full human second, unless there's some like catastrophic issue with the computer, 1 full second is always enough time to preload. So that leads me to create the systems in a way where when I start an asset, I'm immediately trying to prepare my next asset, knowing that I have a lot of time. Like, if I'm playing a 30-second movie and I'm getting ready for the next movie, if I start that 30-second movie, I can immediately start getting my next asset ready and have 29 whole seconds where I don't need to be in a time crunch, doing frame checks every frame. I can just say, okay, well, this movie started, it's running safely. Now I'm just going to dot preload, and I know it's going to be ready by the time I need to play it. I think if you can set up your systems like that, you're going to save yourself a lot of headache. And over almost like the 8 or 9 years of making these big systems, there's very few that I found that like I haven't been able to go this direction. Sometimes it means you have to convince other people in the kind of chain of command that you're always preparing for the next asset. And when you explain to them especially like this is a simple example, it's just 2 Nikon images on my laptop. But when you start getting to these bigger projects where you're loading these giant images, or you're working on a video wall and it's like 10K by 3K, HAPQ files, there is a good case to be made that there is a lot of stuff going on, and it's going to cost you way more if we have to do it not this way. But if we do it this way, we can save a lot of optimization time. We can save a lot of development time just by planning ahead, the next asset. So the second way is, I would say, usable, maybe not the best way, but very usable. And that's the way where ideally you get the information a little bit, ideally as soon as possible before you have to play it. But what I would do is, in that case, you run the preload, and then I make a recursive script. And what this recursive script does is, this goes back to talking about some of the nice members we have here on the movie file in top. Because we have ones like is fully pre-read, is preloading, is opening, is open. These are kind of different states of the file being open. So for example, is opening and is open are going to be related to the actual hard drive reading it, getting it onto the CPU. Preloading is going to be that time between CPU moving the frames to the GPU. And then is fully pre-read means, we're ready for action. So depending on how much detail you want, you could really get in the weeds and just follow the whole stages of the preloading process. But I find that's like as 99% overkill. And really the only one you need is fully pre-read. Now, this is a trick I use on a lot of different processes, so it's not even just isolated to this, but any time where I have to check and confirm something has happened okay. So, for example, we're doing it here for is fully pre-read. I've done a lot of time for checking to see if downloads are finished in the background. I've done it a ton of times to see if maybe I'm uploading something to a server and I need to check to see if it's finished. I can run a script like this that just keeps pinging the server until it gets a HTTP request of 200, which means like we're all good. There's a bunch of different situations where you can use this technique of running a script recursively. And the idea behind it is that we set a condition. So in this case, I'm just gonna, this is what I do a lot of time for Python too, because I'm not a computer scientist. I'll just write it in English and then I'll come back and like fill it in with real code after. So what I'll say is if we're good, proceed with things. And if we're not good, check again in a couple frames. And this is the basic idea behind a recursive script. And if we start kind of switching this over to code, what we could do is something like, okay, well, first we know we're going to need a reference to this movie file in top. So let me just start by setting up some of this stuff up here. So op movie file in 1, and The status that we're checking is going to be that member that we talked about, which is fully pre-read. So I'll go ahead and just copy that out of my browser. So the status is going to be op movie file in one dot is fully pre-read. And then if I want to make these if statements real Python, I'll say, okay, well, if we're good is going to essentially equate to if status is true. Because if we look at our documentation, is fully pre-read as a bool. So that means it's either going to be true or false. And it's going to be true if the movie is pre-read and ready to play, and false basically across the board in any other situation. So I can just say if status, which is the short Python form, it means if status equals true, or you could just write if status equals true. And proceed with things. For now, let's just print we're ready to play. Oh, gotta be careful about these quotation marks. Ready to play. And then if we're not good is essentially going to be every other situation where this isn't true. So I can just put this, replace it with an else. Now, this part, check in a couple of frames. Now, if you're coming from a Python background, I know this is a real common question where people try to run for loops, and then they want to basically just pause between the iterations of the for loop, which is not something you can or want to do in TouchDesigner. Because if you do that, then essentially if you do the time.sleep, the whole TouchDesigner process stops because it's all just single-threaded all the time. So in that case, this is kind of like a replacement to that Python strategy of running a for loop and kind of putting a delay between the iterations, where I can say, okay, well, if I want to check, if I just want to run this script again, I can say me.run. And me is essentially, I mean, you could replace this me with, op text 3. You've probably seen this .run syntax before, especially I think if you've done our Python workshops. But in this case, the nice quick way is me.run. And then I just set a delay frames, and I say, you know what, run me again in 5 frames. I usually try not to run it every frame. If your if you're working for NASA and you got to launch on the exact frame that it's ready, otherwise, it goes up and explodes. Cool, check it every frame. In real life, I find the difference between one frame checking of, which in a lot of times is going to be 30-ish milliseconds, and checking it in 2 frames, which is 60 milliseconds, is not huge, or 3 frames, which is only 100 milliseconds, also not a big deal. So I would say be as generous as you can, because it doesn't help to just constantly do stuff. You might as well give it a little bit of second to try and check if it's working or not. So this then is my kind of checker script. And what that means is that from my preload script, I can say op movie file in one.preload, and then immediately start running my little iterative script here. So I can say op text3.run, which then kicks into my script here, which does the first status check. If it's true, it's going to print me we're ready to play. If it's not, it's just going to wait and run itself again in 5 frames. And it's just going to keep going through this cycle until it passes this status of true, which then it doesn't get to the me.run part again. So let's put this into action. Let's see what's going on here. Let me open up my text port. Put this down here. Which image is loaded now? Let me just make a new movie file in. We want to make sure there's nothing in that texture space on the GPU. We want freshness. So I turn play off. Gonna go select my image here. And these are JPEGs, by the way, so they're heavily, these are hyper compressed. If these are PNGs, they probably be a couple hundred megs, and if they're anything else, probably similar. So as we can see right now, this is not preloaded, because if I middle click on it, it's still got the 1280 by 720 texture space. So what I'm going to do is right click and run this. What we're expecting is that shortly after I run it, I'm going to get a print statement here that says we're ready to play. And you saw it, it really does not take long for that to happen. And we didn't have a huge, 1 or 2 or 3 second stall of the project. then you could just continue. Like, this is the thing with movie players is I find we always trying to skip steps. But if you kind of just work in these steps, that's why I said it's boring and maybe not glamorous, because now we can just replace, okay, well, if print ready to play, I can just make another script here that's going to be the play script. I'll make text 4 over here. That's going to be op movie file in 1.par.play equals 1. And that's just going to flip this on for me. And then instead of printing here, I'll run my play. I really should name this scripts. I know. I haven't eaten all day, so excuse me. Just let me have this one. And this is another situation where, unless you're working for NASA, I'm a big believer in don't run 2 scripts on the same frame ever. There's like, I never have a reason to do that. And the only thing that's ever happened in my life from doing that is strange bugs. So if I'm doing a situation like this where like a thing is done and I'm like ready to do the thing, I give it a frame. What's 33 milliseconds or even 16 milliseconds between friends? And then that's going to hit the play. So that's all good. Now, if we're going to continue this kind of automation sense of things, what I would also then do is, because we have this play script, I'm going to name these scripts. I'm sorry, it's already bugging me too much. That's going to be play. I'm making that play. I'm just going to call this preload check. I wouldn't be able to sleep with myself tonight if I didn't do this. Okay, so, and this is preload. That's what this is. This is unload. Okay, peace has been restored in the galaxy. Okay, so we got our preload script. It starts the preload. It runs the preload check. Preload check does all this good stuff we wanted. When it's ready, it's going to hit play. So then I would then go in here, and what I do in almost every single preload script is immediately before doing my preload is I just turn off the play button. There's almost no situation I've ever encountered where I want to preload with the play button on. So every preload script, first thing I do is turn play off, do my preload, run my check. When the check is ready, it's going to hit play and start my video. Now, this is great. Another option, I think, for this kind of system, so because this system will basically just get it ready and play it immediately. So this is where a lot of the variations based on the system that you need to build come into play. So for example, what you could do is do this preload situation, but don't play it as soon as it's ready. Just maybe do something. This is also a very common thing I do, which is I'll have a status operator here, something like a constant chop, and I'll call this preload status. And then I'll have the first channel essentially just be a flag that tells me if I'm allowed to even hit play or not. So in this case, the ready to play could be, okay, well, once I'm ready to play, set preload status .par.value 0 to 1. And then that way, what happens is this sets it to 1. And then later, if my script to hit play comes in, it has to also check, is that value 1? If it's 1, continue and hit play. If it's not, you're not allowed to hit play. You got to get back into another iterative script where you're just checking until this preload status is ready. Then you're allowed to hit play. So you can decouple these things. They don't actually have, like in this example, I have them all following each other, but you can decouple them. Hey folks, thanks for watching. If you're serious about learning TouchDesigner and getting into our interactive and immersive industry, I highly recommend you check out the Interactive and Immersive HQ Pro. It's the only educational resource and community of its kind for TouchDesigner interactive professionals. You can click the link in the description to learn more about that. And if you liked this video, hit that like button. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe and click on the little bell icon for more awesome free content.